Arguing with robots is my new hobby, is what I feel like it is. Like, no, you didn't. No, that is not correct. You did not follow directions. No, try again. Do it again, but better. Like,
do it again, but pretend you're nice this time. Pretend you understand what I'm telling you to do.
Flashbacks from our parents.
On this episode of Agentic DevOps, we have an hour-long conversation, we meaning Nirmal Mehta, my co-host, and I, with Eitan Yarmush of Solo.io. He's a senior architect there and leading a couple of projects. One of them is kagent, which is a Kubernetes tool operator that runs different parts of your AI or agentic DevOps on Kubernetes. So it's exciting to get very into the weeds of MCP tooling, of what is agents and what does that look like in infrastructure, the security, authentication, and the permission model of these things. So we get into some nerdy stuff in here, but we're talking really about the kagent open source project and what that entails and what problems that's trying to solve in Kubernetes world and cloud native. I just got off the live stream with the two of them, and it was a great discussion, and I hope you enjoy. Eitan, welcome.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello. Thank you for having me. Yes, we will be talking about agentic DevOps. Maybe this is the first generational shift in technology that I've seen, but I think it's cool. You know, obviously there's a lot of confusion and a lot of hype, but I also think a lot of cool things are going to happen. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, I've not been this scared about like an exciting, like a new technology. I'm honestly nervous, nervous what could go wrong. I was maybe nervous when my first container production deployment. I think I was nervous then too, but I don't think I felt the same way about how maybe things could be wildly wrong. And
yeah, wild. It's, it's a phase shift. It's like, I think up until now, computers have been deterministic, right? And now they're not.
At least we try to make them as much as possible. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I would debate whether they're deterministic at all, but
radiation from the side, flipping bits aside, right?
Yeah, we've
true.
worked as an industry, especially on the operations side, on the DevOps side, we've worked for a decade now plus on trying to remove as much non-determinism out of our systems as possible, right? That's the whole entire point of like cloud native computing and containers and infrastructure as code and repeatable 100%. Pipelines and everything. And now we're kind of, I think the core of my nervousness is we're like introducing the thing that we've been trying to remove. And we're doing it at like a very fast pace with very nebulous guardrails, which I think we'll get into soon too. But I think, I don't know, I don't want to speak for Bret's behalf, but that's where my nervousness is coming from.
Yeah. It's like, it feels like a little bit of a double-edged sword because it's so different and there's so much potential for inefficiency, or like we've all had that, at least for the last couple of years, we've all had that experience of like just trying to get code gen essentially. Like arguing with robots is my new hobby, is what I feel like it is. Like, no, you didn't. No, that is not correct. You did not follow directions. No, try again. Do it again, but better. Like,
do it again, but pretend you're nice this time. Pretend you understand what I'm telling you to do.
Flashbacks from our parents.
It actually, you made me think, because in the, in the podcast intro doc that you send out, you said, what's the number one thing that you would like people to take away? And I think for me, the most important thing to take away is, yes, obviously, like we need to be not nervous, but apprehensive, right? We need to be realistic. But at the same time, the technology here is what we've been dealing with for the base is the same. It's just magic in and out. And that's okay. And I think for ourselves in the containerization, Kubernetes DevOps world, there's so many lessons that we can carry through. And that's so important. So not to get overwhelmed with all the changes, but rather understand the scope of what's happening and try and use it to our benefit and not get too overhyped, et cetera, and be safe.
Yeah. Speaking of hype, this podcast is actually trying to be as hypeless as possible. Anti-hype. I don't know what you want to call the opposite of hype. Boring? No, that's the wrong word. It's not boring.
No, the podcast is hype so that the technology is boring.
Right. No. There we go. Because there is so much out there. In fact, honestly, if I walked around a conference right now and I walked around the floor and everybody's shouting like Agents, MCP, and then I make someone show me a production ready workflow or whatever we want to call these, these tool prompts where we have a series of steps that agents or sub-agents or all the different terms that we're all trying to make up on the fly. Basically, this workflow with AI involved. Show me a production one that you are trusting enough right now in real world production that is useful and makes sense, like it saves time or money or something over humans. Make people show me this stuff. I bet you it'd be really hard for someone to show me, because right now, every single video I see is people tinkering, or every single article is people showing off a demo. But I'm like, that's not real world. That is such a demo. That is hype. So I think one of the things I really want to get on this show is get into the nerdy details of how this is working. Where do you see it going wrong? Like specific examples. I think the first place we're all starting to tinker with it is maybe in CI. I'm seeing a lot of new GitHub actions lately that are MCP related, and people trying to do like, PR summaries and some stuff like that. And that feels like maybe the right place to do it, because it's pre-production and the AI doesn't have write access to my cluster. But anyway,
so let's start there. Write access? I don't know about all that. Will we get there?
Maybe 3 years, 5
now?
What do you mean? We're not going to YOLO in production? We're not going to YOLO this stuff in production?
I agree with you 100%, Brett. And I think for me, probably the most valuable use case that I have seen is incident response and debugging. So as an example, right, one of the things that these models are so good at is taking just obscene amounts of information and distilling them. Now, obviously, you need to set up guardrails and the correct prompts, and there's pieces that are very important. But if you think about what incident response is, right, at its core, you receive some notification about a thing that's going wrong, and then you go and you get a whole bunch of information from, whether it could be from your dashboards in Grafana or Datadog, or directly going through Splunk for logs, right? Whatever it is, you're bringing together this huge amount of information from known data sources, and then you're trying to find exactly where the error went wrong. And that's one of the areas that we know and have seen can be successful. And actually, I have a funny little anecdote, though, about this. I was helping a community user because he had set up a Jira MCP server to do exactly this, where he basically said, hey, can you resolve this ticket? And what happened was it went off, found the ticket, found the information, found the problem, and fixed it. Now, in that same session, this user then said, okay, now can you fix this other ticket? Now, the second ticket named the deployment the same thing. And so the AI, when trying to fix the second problem, just refixed the first problem because it didn't understand that they were different things. And it's like in that moment, you see the magic. It's there, and then the train just derails, right? So and I think that is like the definition of this moment for me, where it's like you are watching magic happen, and then the guy falls off his skateboard.
It's like a little bit like amateur magic.
Yes, exactly.
Now, talking real quick about this specific example, talking about like in the troubleshooting mode, essentially like AI troubleshooters, I definitely imagine us all eventually, I call them AI buddies, having we have designed, whether we have system prompts or however we're doing it, we've designed a way for AI to help us with troubleshooting. I want to do a shout out real quick, though, to a video that I saw. I know nothing about this company, but I saw a really, really good video on this from the AI Native Dev Con Day thing.
So
this guy, Kyle Foster from Runwin, he was really good at explaining that it turns out that AI is really good at reading human text, but if you give it a bunch of metric data or just access to dashboards, it's not very good at figuring that data out. I guess they're a product company that's trying to solve this problem for like SREs and trouble. But he talked about how like you can give it all this massive troubleshooting data, but other than like reading logs and just looking for the human words in logs, it's maybe not great at looking at metric dashboards and stuff like that. Anyway, it was a really interesting talk. I have no idea if any of this is true because I have not been this advanced in my AI work yet, but it's an interesting problem that they were trying to solve, and that evidently AIs aren't necessarily good at for troubleshooting.
So while we're talking about this use case, what are the components of these solutions, these architectures that we're talking about? Maybe we should kind of get into like the 101 of some of these things first.
Define MCP before our audience, maybe.
Yes, absolutely. So again, I think that this really is an iteration on another problem. And when you really break down what an agent is, because this word agent is just everywhere, right? It's everywhere. It's everywhere. And it's like, what is that word? Like, what do you mean? What is that even? Is it an application? So I think it's important to kind of ground our understanding of what that word even means. So I'll try and do that quickly. And I think I should be able to.
There's words like agent, MCP, LLMs, chat.
Yes,
Okay,
indeed.
go for it.
So when I personally think about an agent, and I'm happy to be proven wrong on this, I think about it in really three parts. And it's only three parts. In fact, one of my coworkers the other day said to me, he said, it's not an agent, it's an agent template, right? Because what you're actually talking about is a system prompt, right? Which is, some set of English, because these models speak English. An LLM, that's the thing actually interpreting the English or whatever you're feeding into it. And then there's the tools. And that's it. That's the whole thing, right? When you talk about an agent, you're literally talking about this. I just want to ground it there. There's all this talk about agent framework X, agent framework Y. This is all that an agent really is. And the tools are where it gets all of its information. So when we talk about an agent, we're talking about those three parts and a core loop, right? So we have a human over here, say Bob, right? Bob says, let's put this in Kubernetes terms, right? I want all the pods in my cluster. Give me the pods. Then that gets appended to a system prompt, passed to an LLM with a list of tools. And the LLM says, hey, I don't know what pods are, but there's this tool that says I can list pods. That's awesome. I'm going to go list those pods. Okay. And then it comes back. That's the whole thing. So if that's the whole thing, then tools are what make these systems so powerful. Now, these tools can be anything, right? It could be Docker, Slack, GitHub.
Anything with an API, essentially.
Anything, exactly. Anything with an API, which if you're a discerning member of this circle, you might know exactly where I'm going to go next on anything with an API. Wink, wink. So if a tool is just anything with an API, right? It could be in code originally with the original agents, right? These were code functions. But that's exactly why MCP was created. So MCP stands for Model Context Protocol, is essentially a language, is a protocol for agents, which again is just a set of system prompt, LLM, and tools to communicate with external things, right? So if we think about the LLM as the brain of the system, the tools are its hands, exactly like a human being. Your brain is making decisions, but if you just had a brain in a jar, like in Futurama, it wouldn't actually be able to do anything. It has to be attached to a body that can actually then action on the things that it wants to do. And so what MCP does is it standardizes that interface. So now AWS, they just released their own MCP server. Google's going to do the same thing. Azure's going to do the same thing. Datadog already did it. Everybody did it. So now you can just access all of the data and actions without having to write any new code. So that's kind of the high level view. I did it in 2 minutes. Before I move on to layering a bit, is there anything you guys want to jump in with? Or
I like this simple kind of way of thinking about an agent. I really appreciate you simplifying that down, because we can rationalize about this, right?
Yeah.
Calling tools and understanding what tools do and how to use them is essentially a core component of our show and our roles in IT. And MCP is kind of like a standard spec to explain what a tool does and what we should expect from the tool in a defined way. So in theory, if we wanted to do agents by hand, if you will, you could remove the LLM part and system prompt from this, put a human in as the agent, and they could read the MCP protocol and say, oh, Slack allows me to open a channel and message a person, and Docker allows me to create a Docker container and run a Docker container. So if you just read the MCP spec for a service, it's essentially what I just said in written English form.
I think that is actually such a perfect way to think about it. Yeah, is if you remove the other piece, you're left with actually just what we do, right? What we do on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And that makes sense. Yeah. That's really cool. So I think this is where it jumps up like half a level, but I do just want to mention it. This is what I call the 7-layer cake of agents, where basically the way that we think about it is if these agents are just, LLM and system prompt, then what you really have all over the place is what we call the framework layer. And that's the thing that manages the agents. And then the agent may talk to each other and they may talk to a tool. So you have this tiered approach, but fundamentally, that's it, right? You have your simple agent, and then you have a framework on top just to manage running them. And that's typically, I'd say, like coming out of the theoretical for a second, right? That's how these things get run.
So that's a great segue. Where do you run these things?
God, that's such a good question. The answer is nobody's sure yet, right? We have some opinions about it. Others have some, yeah. Kubernetes, I mean, obviously Kubernetes, but
but not necessarily, obviously. Yeah.
Well, you're right. Not necessarily, obviously,
yeah.
to us, maybe. But basically, I think that's actually a big problem. When I talk to people at KubeCon, one of the biggest takeaways for me was people don't know how to run these things. Like they build something on their laptop, they have a little bit of Python code or some TypeScript code, and they're like, but like what do, it's like, okay, I have this thing, but I don't actually know where to put it. I don't know how to run it. Is it just an app? Like what's actually happening here? And I think that the typical answer, if you go the LangChain Crew AI route, is that it's SaaS, right? Which will work for some people, but it usually won't work for these larger enterprises, especially the ones that want to deploy on-prem. And
right.
So what we said is let's actually take what we learned about building agents and simplifying them, and then wrap it in such a way that you can run and build just like you would any other Kubernetes app. And that's how we ended up at Cage.
Yeah. So one way to simplify that is to think about these agents as just another app that's running in whatever environment you run your applications in.
If you start playing around with any MCP tooling, I've been playing a lot with the Docker tooling because it's so easy to use and it's container native, which is like my whole thing. So that fits my vibe. And I love the idea of, especially when they're basically binary tools like curl or Chrome or whatever tool I might want to be using, it makes sense that those are all going to be individual containers, and then I need to somehow orchestrate that, whether it's local or my system, my company is going to run them somewhere else. And the concept of like, eventually you might have 1,000 tools in your organization that are MCP tools, and they may not all need to be running at the same time. It leans into ideas around functions as a service or Lambda, and you start to think out big enough, and you're like, we need some sort of system to manage these things, to run these things, to decide when they're on or off, maybe to spin up 20 copies at all of us, because there's all these different agents running different versions or different copies of the tool. Yeah. I mean, you start to think out far enough, and you're like, okay, is it just Kubernetes, or do I actually need something else to run this? And because I don't want to have to run Kubernetes locally every time, I just want to run an MCP tool. How does this all shake out? And we all met for, like, this is a spoiler here, like the three of us, we had like a jazz session at KubeCon where we just stopped by the booth after a keynote and we're like, okay, what is Kagent? What is this thing? And we went down a rabbit hole of like talking, like I think we talked like 4 different topics in a matter of 10 minutes. But this is us basically having that same conversation in a longer format for the rest of humanity to enjoy. So Kagent, what problem is that solving?
So what Kagent aims to solve is it aims to deliver this specifically for people in Kubernetes, right? But the thing that I want to mention is just, again, the infinite layer cake. We're talking about spinning up tools, right? Then we get into this whole issue of security, right? Mm-hmm. Who has access to these MCP servers, right? What tools are you allowed to call? Are you allowed to, as an admin, right? You're maybe allowed to call the delete repo tool, but the guy, like somebody else probably isn't. And then how do tokens work? How does authentication work?
And I just want to mention one thing there, because there's an important asterisk to this MCP thing that maybe if you don't know anything, you might be like, well, shouldn't MCP handle that? It's a protocol, right? Just for our audience sake, the MCP spec, the Model Context Protocol spec, does not contain anything that has to do with security at all. We as an industry have learned zero.
Right. Because we're repeating the mistakes of our past, right?
We have learned 0 things from security in the past, and this protocol, and maybe, we're making fun of this, but, maybe there's actual thought and consideration here, but the protocol itself, the protocol spec has nothing to do with security. So MCP in its spec does not handle like identity federation. It does not handle identity access management. It has no concept of that at all.
Yeah.
So anything that has to do with like observing it, guardrailing it,
You know what?
securing it have to come somewhere outside of that, essentially.
I'll push back on you a little bit, though,
Okay, go for it.
because a spec like OpenAPI, right?
Right.
The security product comes on top, right? In the form of OIDC,
Like OAuth or something.
JOT claims, right? So if
yeah.
we're giving flag to MCP, then we also have to give it to OpenAPI.
Okay. I mean, that's fair. That's fair.
Right. So I think
I just want to, just so that everyone's clear that it does not contain anything to do with like security concepts.
Yeah, because if we're not careful here, MCP or the rapid introduction of MCP tooling to your own workflow or to your companies, particularly if you're running it outside your local system, which is what I think we're all going to eventually be doing. If we're not careful, we're going to recreate the problems of CI, where like CI is now the target of attacks because it is the thing that has access to everything. It has access to the code, if you're doing CD from there, you have access to deploy on servers. Like a lot of CIs that I have seen, CI/CD systems in the past, have been set up in a way that if you had that root account, you basically had access to everything in the company, because CI eventually gets so many workflows or pipelines that all those API keys are stored in one central system for CI. And that's a big attack vector. And that we're already starting to see attacks on MCP endpoints, I guess you could say. And I think that's going to continue. Like, never mind the slop AI code that we're creating, but like the actual MCP itself. So yeah, this is sort of like, it's good that we have the industry kind of trying to figure this out at the same time. At least we are doing that in the cloud native industry, at least. So maybe not Silicon Valley industry.
So back to you. I interrupted you in the middle of that, but that was an important thing to highlight.
No, it's very important. And I think the reason that I push back is because it's not that you're incorrect. I think you're right. But I also think, and gets back to what I said earlier about taking our lessons from what we've done, right? At the end of the day, all of this is just network calls. Everything is actually just going over the network. And I think that is the thing that I want everyone to understand, is that all of these problems can actually be broken down. You have your agents. Those are an understandable small piece, right? And then you have your tools. And these things are just communicating over the network. So if we take our lessons that we've learned, right, about, right, MTLS and authentication, right, properly passing credentials through the system. Now, the thing where it gets complicated, we might have to figure out what identity looks like, right? Like, I'm going to open a can of worms, right? Does an agent have an identity?
And is it federating, right? Say you're a platform engineer, like let's pretend you're a platform engineering team and you want to expose an agent framework or agent system to your developers. Do those agents inherit the identity of the developer as they're doing the tasks on behalf of the developer, or are they their own? Do they have their own identity in a service account kind of fashion?
Yeah.
These are all things that we have not figured out yet.
I don't know about you, but my agents, I treat like pets. I name them. I have Bob. I have Betty. They're very special to me, but they're not.
I have Helm agent. No, I'm just kidding.
Are we already at that stage where we have to start figuring out pets versus cattle with respect to agents
for MCP tools? Oh, we're well past. No, but no, we had a lot of these conversations. We've been having these conversations recently because, like I'll bring it back to this, like a lot of how these agents run is in a framework capacity. And so they actually all run in a single binary
context,
right?
Yeah.
So how do you, are they all Bob? I don't know. That doesn't make sense to me, but so
when we break this down into like actual infrastructure, I'm sure there's designs and people out there that are building very monolithic pet approaches to MCP tooling right now, because we are so wild west with it right now. We don't really have industry standards. Not everybody's using these in containers, and the cart got a little bit before the horse there because of the potential for, like Nirmal and I keep laughing about, like firing all the operators. Nobody needs developers anymore. Like it's all fine. Yeah, we can all just get our. Gosh, we haven't said this on the show. What is it? The income thing. Whatever everybody keeps talking about.
Universal basic income.
UBI. There we go. I need to throw that in the show for search for the algorithm. UBI.
But yeah, you're bringing up a good point, Bret, which is back to what we said at the beginning. There's like a nervousness here, and I think we're actually you showed us a diagram of where that nervousness is, right?
Right.
Like the identity of these things, the permissions, the amount of scope we allow these frameworks to operate in. And before we jump into what the agents, just jump back to what an agent is, the system prompt, the LLM. I want to just highlight something that we didn't mention, and that is LLM is in the middle of this. So everything to do with LLMs, regardless of agents, like dealing with tokens, dealing with APIs, and if you're running a local model, dealing with the inference and the compute and the GPU and everything that you need to run that LLM, whether it's a managed service like Bedrock, or if it's Claude, or if it's like a Llama 3.2 running on a pod somewhere in your cluster, you still have to deal with that on top of all this agent stuff as well. As you were zooming out from this picture of an agent and showing multiple agents, there's another view where you're zooming into the LLM part of this, and that's a whole
100%.
scope that is also that we have to take care of if we're running these systems. And so I just want to make sure that like our audience realizes that like agents and these frameworks are not glossing over, they're not like solving that for you yet.
Yeah, you're so right. And it's funny because I exist at this level, so this is how I think, but that black box is huge, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like just scaling inference is like a whole nother put it on the list.
Yeah.
Right? Put it on the
yeah, and by the way, I saw a wonderful. Don't ask me what video. I watch a lot of YouTube. Don't ask me what video I saw this in, but I saw some statistics that from an actual study. I think it was a university study, and like because I just like that green box to me of the LLM box is just it's either Anthropic or OpenAI, right? Like I don't want to mess with that box right now. I am not going to try to pay for GPUs. I recently looked up how much a GPU costs on DigitalOcean. It's insane. I don't know what all the prices are, but they're usually my go-to, and it was ridiculous. There's no way I could afford that. Just like one. But they talked about running your own models because I'm very interested. Now that we have like Llama and we have Docker Model Runner and we have LM Studio, we have all these wonderful ways to run these open source models. And we're talking about open source here. I think eventually this is all going to have to be real, like a lot of stuff's going to have to be open source for us as an industry to consume it. Like you mentioned earlier, SaaS. Like a lot of people, that'll be the answer for a lot of this agent stuff. But a lot of us are going to run it ourselves. But I saw a statistic that showed that, particularly around engineering topics, that even all these open source models are like less than half accurate as the foundational models that we consider running, from Google and Microsoft, Anthropic, and OpenAI. And so that made me kind of sad because I really was hoping that sometime soon we were going to end up with like the cloud native model. That's kind of what I want. Like I want a model trained on the latest versions of every cloud native tool, every beta release, so that my model's fully refreshed and it's been trained up to date. And I need like a cloud native service that does that for me for like as an open source thing. But I guess we're that's an imaginary idea that I don't know if anyone's thought of or working on.
No,
but I don't think it's that far-fetched, honestly.
I don't think it's that far-fetched. You're so right, first of all. But I think, and I think also it's interesting because I don't really want to get into the politics of it, but I think a lot of that open source model conversation, right? You end up in geopolitics really fast. And it's a really complex discussion to have. But in terms of the cloud native thing, no, I totally agree. And actually, so part of kagent, we release a tool that can basically vectorize any documentation set. And so along with kagent, we ship basically these little vector DBs of a whole bunch of cloud native project documentation.
So there you go.
Oh, wow.
There you go, Bret.
That is cool. My wish has been granted.
Yes. All right. So to that point, you want to show us some of these agents real quick and what like a K agent looks like?
Yeah. There's obviously not a lot of time. So I'm going to go really, really fast. Yeah. What we're going to do here is I'm just going to kind of show off what I mean by it's so simple to create an agent. What I'll first do is I'll just chat with our Kubernetes agent. And so just for some context, the way that I deployed this into Kubernetes is just a single Helm install. So you really need basically nothing to get started. And so immediately you end up with a natural language interface because that's how we talk with all of our software now. So, I'll ask it, hey, can you list all the pods in my cluster just for fun? And let's see what it comes back to me with. So we'll see here that it's getting these resources, then it's going to list them for me. And of course, it maintains the context across this conversation so I can say, oh, well, it looks like I'm having an issue with my kagent pods. Now, obviously, this is very simple, but it's just to show, like, again, you see on the right all the different tools that it has access to. So in this particular case, right, I'm only actually showing off one, but even just that one is really powerful, right? Because now I have all of the information about it and I didn't have to remember any kubectl commands. I know we all speak kubectl pretty intensely, but that's not necessarily true for people who are new, right? Kubernetes can be a lot. So let's say,
just to appreciate this, like 3 years ago, if you had shown me, this would have been like absolutely magic.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Up and take my money. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. I mean, it's incredible. While you're typing that, it's incredible how normalized we have already gotten in such a quick time to be thinking about just natural language questions and expecting a decent response from a system is wild.
Yeah, I agree. So I just did a follow-up question. Again, it keeps maintaining context, right? So I say, hey, are there any events? There weren't any events because it's been a chill day here at my kind cluster. So, but the thing I want to jump into next is, again, we talked about how simple it is to create these agents. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And in order to do that, and I'll show off what the YAML for this thing looks like afterward, just super simple, but I'm going to do it through the UI. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a GitHub agent. Oops. GitHub agent. We don't need to give a description this time. So this agent can interact with GitHub. And basically what this agent is going to be able to do is I'm going to give it access to the GitHub MCP server, right? And so that's the tool that it's going to have, and then it's going to have a system prompt, and we're going to be off to the races. So you'll see here, I'm using GPT-4.1. So you're a helpful agent, always be clear, et cetera, et cetera. And then we'll say, you have extensive knowledge of the GitHub API, act like an expert software engineer or something, right? Because if you tell it, one hack for prompting is if you tell it who to act like, it gets a lot better. It's magic. So, but anyway, so
you don't threaten it. You don't threaten it with like
I do threaten it, but that's in chat.
I'm glad that's
so now I've actually
here for posterity.
Behind the scenes, I added a GitHub tool server. And so basically what that's going to do is it's going to deploy a MCP server for GitHub using my credentials. And so now I can just pick the tools from that MCP server that I want. So let's say we want to be able to, get file contents, list the commits, get issue details, and search users. That sounds good to me. So we're going to create our agent. And okay, we've created our agent. So now I can interact with it. And that's it. So let's say, hey, can you list all of the repos in the kagent dev org?
How quickly do you hit API limits with this?
Of course. No, I don't usually. And unfortunately,
Okay.
Of course, now that I'm doing this live, I did this a million times before I got on. Decided not to work. You don't have... Oh, I didn't give it the right tools. You know what? Honestly, it's too smart for me. So I didn't give it search repositories. Okay, so let's give it the correct tools. Yeah.
This is a perfect example of exactly what we were talking about. Where does the identity come from, right? So in this case, you've put an identity into the MCP server. And by identity, I mean literally like identity access management identity. The MCP server has an identity, like a service account, and it didn't inherit, you logged into this, the agent didn't inherit your permissions. It's using the permissions of the MCP server that it's talking to.
Yeah.
Correct. Again, if I were to go into the whole identity lifecycle, it would be all of things. Yeah, you are 100% right.
We definitely have to do another episode about that, because this is where, as infrastructure operators, platform engineers that are probably watching this show, that's where we need to know the details of how to deploy these things.
100%. And I would love to come on and talk about that stuff.
Yeah, this feels like, gosh, how many times have we done this over and over again? I was getting ready to say this feels like the early days of Kerberos, where we got transitive login way back in the days. Like we were able to pass our permissions through other systems. We call it single sign on the internet and stuff like that, but more in enterprisey ways. Yeah, it's like, wouldn't my GitHub pat or my OAuth be the natural conclusion to all of this, where when I log in, everything I have, so the agent is, because that's the thing, one of the things that the core fundamentals of this is like, This is why we're not going to all be replaced, is because the company can't fire the tool. It can only fire me. It needs me to give permissions and me to take a responsibility for the actions that I'm taking here, because I'm the one prompting it. It's not like it's just doing prompts all day long on its own, although maybe that is like the inevitability of all this, is the AI is prompting the AI nonstop all day, and we're just sitting back drinking Mai Tais. But this is actually super cool. I didn't actually expect us to get this deep and talking about like even the different tools. Well, why wouldn't you give it all GitHub tools right now? Like, why wouldn't you just select all of those and give it 50 tools or whatever?
That's such a good question. So we're actually running into a thing here that I'll explain. Basically, and this is a problem that right now, essentially, when I told it to list commits, it got a huge JSON blob, which like messes with the system. But the reason I didn't give it more is, and actually this is a fundamental scaling property of agents for now, where basically they are kind of like the smartest toddlers you've ever interacted with, right? The context window is really small. And so what you need, and so they can only handle like 20 tools, right?
It's
and
the perfect
tools
analogy.
can be anything, right? So like if you give a toddler a hammer, it's like, okay, fine. Like I can, mostly hit this
plastic hammer,
not, right? But then sure. But then you give them I don't know.
Chainsaw.
I'm not handy. Something confusing.
Chainsaw.
A chainsaw. Yeah, exactly. Right. They'll just not be able to pick it up.
Right.
Or they won't understand how to start it. So the more you overload, the less that they're able to do. And so that gets back into what I was talking about the layer cake, where you actually have agents talking to agents, right? Because if you abstract functionality behind other agents, then you don't hit that limit. So it's almost like a mental limit, but it's software. So it's really weird.
So I think this is a great kind of place to kind of stop our conversation. But because what you're describing is essentially microservices.
Yes, it's 100% microservices.
And I think so there's a couple of analogies that I'd like to kind of throw at you and see if you agree. One is from the permission standpoint and orchestration and workflow standpoint of these agents talking to each other and the permissions. I suspect it's gonna look very similar to how we deploy our CI/CD pipeline tools, because those tools also have to have permissions to, run Terraform apply on infrastructure and log into GitHub and pull code down and like build a container locally, right? Or push a container to a registry. So we already have some patterns around giving automation tools permissions, and this is going to look similar to that. It's just less formalized than maybe some of those tools. The other analogy here is that agent to agent and deploying these things and scaling them, they're like microservices. Back to your toddler with a limited set of tools. You want to think about these architectures as breaking down broader problems, such as troubleshooting a cluster or troubleshooting your application, into smaller components, and then the agents are attached to those smaller components, and multiple agents interact together to solve a problem, not one agent with 100 tools solving a problem. And then the last piece of this, which again is the LLM component, right? Where that context window is small, and unlike almost every other kind of application that we've run over the years where compute has gotten cheaper and memory has gotten cheaper, we are now running an application as microservices where the compute is more expensive as things go. And so that's another, like we have typically not considered the cost of an API call, like in our infrastructure. But now we as operators of these, we have to actually think about the per call cost of these agents.
You hear I see the anecdotal like tweets of people's like, this is, these, especially the agentic stuff. This thing is amazing, and I'm spending $300 a day or whatever. Like, I see stuff like that, and then I spent
$20 and spun up this Kubernetes cluster.
Because I imagine like we talked about this in the last podcast. My vision for this is like, whether it's 6 months from now or 2 years from now or 5 days from now, I have no idea when this is all going to mature enough that I can just basically give a list of outcomes I want the cluster on AWS. I need 3 clusters in these zones. I need these policies. I need this outcome. Also apply this thing. Do Argo. Do this thing. Install certs. And then I go away, and $300 later, it has deployed it, tested it, corrected itself, deployed, tried to test, and correct itself. And eventually it's ready for a commit, or it's ready for a PR. Yeah. And I just went to lunch, and I came back, and it did its thing. But it was probably not free.
Yeah. That was a $300 lunch.
Exactly, including the AWS infrastructure of constantly, spinning it up, tearing it down, spinning it up, tearing it down.
True.
Anyway, that's my vision.
So, parting thoughts?
Well, okay, let me make sure I understand this from like the noob's perspective. Let's see if I can get the elevator pitch here. Okay, so we've got kagent, which is a Kubernetes-specific tool for running MCP tools on Kubernetes that I can use, and it manages the orchestration of the tooling, the MCP tool specifically, with an optional web interface. Am I screwing this all up?
No, a little bit. You're not. You're not all wrong. But it's interesting that was the takeaway from the demo. We don't manage the tool lifecycle.
Oh, okay.
So the tools are just microservices in our minds.
Okay.
Right? So we imagine those being very typical, like just deployed Argo, et cetera, et cetera. We're specifically in deploying agents, which I know is a loaded term, but
okay. So you're not trying to rewrite the Kubernetes deployment. You see this as like tools are just deployments. They're normal Kubernetes things. We're not changing this. Yeah.
Exactly.
So what is managing the MCP servers?
The user.
So that's outside of the scope of kagent.
Correct.
Got it. So I would imagine maybe there's another CNCF project out there for managing MCP servers. Of course, MCP servers are super simple.
If I'm going to manage all this myself, all of these are going to be in my cluster. If I'm running my own, if I'm not doing like N8N or some other SaaS product that's managing all my MCP, I'm looking at this screen from Docker Hub of all of the MCP servers, and I'm like, yeah, I want like dozens of these, and I just want to be able to issue LLM requests and stuff. So I have to manage all this myself. So kagent isn't doing that. I got it.
So if you think about, there's so many people in this space, and I'm guessing that there are people looking at this particular problem. So we take the idea that the tools exist, and we call them, right? And we handle security, RBAC, things like that. But that the actual like spinning up of tools, running them in your cluster, right? Like I agree with you. We're going to want a ton of them. But if it's just a deployment, if it's just a service, right? We know services. We've been doing that for years, right? Let's run those. I got no problem with that.
Yeah. So I think one takeaway is that MCP servers are just applications with an API that are just running a specific spec and protocol.
And they have a key that accesses another API that I'm going to give like way too much access to. Yeah. Cool. My path's going to be in the Kubernetes servers now. So.
And does kagent handle the calls to the LLMs and like context windows and tokens and all that? Okay, got it.
So, and on the thing you said about giving the permissions, right? What kagent can do is it can actually pass the user token through, right? So that essentially the agents and tools are acting as human. Because that's how we are viewing identity right now, which again, it might not play out that way, but that's how we're seeing it.
That makes sense.
That's going to be an interesting space for sure. Like we just had Keycloak on last week, and we didn't mention like in the Keycloak world, there's not mentions of AI or agents, but I would imagine that like services like Keycloak, identity access management services are going to become, they're already very important, but they're going to become even more important in this agentic world. So as operators, we should keep an eye on that for sure. Well, awesome. This was just an amazing conversation.
I feel like this is part 1 of 5. Like this is
absolutely.
But we are normally like product focused on this show. Like let's show us this tool. Let's dive into this tool. But this is just how exciting all this and how new all this stuff is. It's like I don't even understand it all myself, and this is all I do. This is all I've been doing for like 3 or 4 months, and I still feel like I'm just at the tip of the iceberg of really how this operates. How do we control and operate these things safely? what are useful workflows and ideas of this instead of just pie in the sky demo stuff. It's all super great. So we definitely would love to invite you back on for another round if you're willing to take the questions from the peanut gallery that we are. Well, thank you everyone for being here. We are going to wrap it up today. We've got a hard stop, and it has been a great show, and it's going to make some people even more confused. So they're going to have to come back for more episodes.
We have removed a lot of confusion today.
Okay.
I feel a lot more comfortable. Let's say each episode we're getting less and less nervous about agentic workflows.
Maybe we should have just called the show Explain AI to Bret like he's 5. Like maybe that's just what the show should have been.
Like he's a toddler with a hammer. Can't figure out the chainsaw.
I want the chainsaw. Yeah.
Perfect. On that note.
Well, thank you everyone for being here.
And subscribe to agenticdevops.fm and please share it with your friends, family, colleagues.
That's how we get sponsors, is we have to have people listening. So please listen. Please download.
Please listen. Let others know. Cool.
All right.
Cheers.
Thanks everybody. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.